So, a summary of the book, Waters for Fighting For by John Fleck. There are a couple themes that really came up and resonated with me, especially in the direction I'm going to go with integrated water resource management. First one is fighting over scarcity has never solved our water issues. If we look to collaboration, conservation, and water share efforts, we can find these solutions, and he's shown that in the book multiple times. The network, quotes, is the institutional infrastructure needed to get to these sustainable solutions. And we do that by cheap talk. I tried to research some of the cheap talk definitions. I couldn't find anything really good, but I like the notion of cheap talk. A low stakes environment where all the stakeholders can meet up and discuss these issues without fear of retribution from their tribes or committing to an agreement. This is just cheap talk. Since my topic is integrated water resource management, I started thinking about the definition of integrity and integration. And I found this quote from the book, Waters for Fighting Over. It says, "It is possible to scale back that in a way that conserves water to respond to shortfalls while preserving the integrity of the communities that grew up around our old ways of allocating and using the water's flow." In this case, when we think about integration, we can think about the integrity of all these different links having to be put together for the integrity of the entire system. If any of those links are not solid and those relationships aren't addressed, the whole system falls apart. So a little background in integrated water resource management. There are three essential parts: the enabling environment, institutional arrangements, and management instruments. In the enabling environments, just setting up the framework under which the other integrations can happen. Institutional arrangements are just how different institutions will work together. And management instruments are how are we going to get this done once the policy and the institutional arrangements are made. Why do we need integrated water resource management? Well, to quote Bruce P. Hooper, "Effective governance in the water sector is not linear, prescriptive, and logical. Rather, it tends to be adaptive and messy, responding to the dynamic nature of the political and economic forces operating at the time and in response to changing environmental conditions." Well, let's look at those three. It's not linear. The people at the bottom of the watershed have to work with the people at the top of the watershed and the people in between, and people who have no vested stake necessarily in that watershed, legislators from the state or nationally. And it can't be prescriptive. You can't say that at this amount of pollution coming downstream, we need to shut you off. And lastly, it's not logical. If anything's taught us, people are not logical, and we need to talk to their emotional sides when addressing these issues. A necessary ingredient that was pointed out in the textbook about integrated water resource management was the cultural context. One of the quotes I pulled from the text is, "Colorado had just experienced what was at the time its worst drought on record," which says, qualifies best as punishment meted out to an impudent culture by an indignant God. We need to acknowledge culture as relevant and tied to human rights. Otherwise, we will polarize the discussion and nothing can get done. I appreciated how Fleck pointed out that culture oftentimes is defended by either side. And in that case, it's impossible to get anything done because people are fighting for their culture's survival. When looking at integrated water resource management, enabling environment, that's the background into which all the other integration is discussed. It looks like the IWRM just gives very little attention to the policy part. IWRM's enabling environment is mostly for formal entities, policy that's already been made, legal statutes that have already been made, and investment. What I appreciate about Fleck is he makes the case for the policies in the cheap talk, as opposed to assuming that that's just a microscopic part of the entire issue. He makes it the background of his entire book. In the enabling environment, rights and assets of all stakeholders are acknowledged, lower levels establish rules on the game, and principle of subsidiary is one that the central authorities should perform tasks that cannot be performed at the local levels. Integrated water resource management addresses the geographical aspects by requiring as one of their standards to have a GIS component. In other words, they'll be modeling ground and surface water and looking at the flows so that you can have a data-driven process. Fleck puts the Colorado River within an environmental context with his discussion about the Cienega de Santa Clara. It's a pretty much the delta where all the Colorado River water eventually ended up once it passed through Mexico's borders. They had dried up, but through collaboration, they were able to release a pulse of water, which was the start of his book. He talked about sitting there and seeing that rush of water come through, and then seeing all the wildlife that bloomed and blossomed just from that one little pulse of water, which tells us that nature is a lot more resilient than we think, and it provides a lot of resources for migratory birds and various other waterfowl. When looking at integrated water resource management and the environmental context that it takes, it acknowledges the necessity and rights of natural systems and acknowledges that they are also human rights. That these resources have embodied in their properties. It also uses impact assessment committees as part of their model. So whatever policies the model is considering taken into account, it will use impact assessment committees, which are also data-driven committees. Essentially, Fleck's Waters for Fighting For is making a case for grassroots integrated water resource management plan. In other words, using cheap talk in the network, cooperation can yield better results than competition.